Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the IIB for our COVID-19 webinar series, presented in partnership with a number of our valued associate professional members. Over the course of the next several weeks, we will explore different lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis, as well as next steps we should be thinking about as FBOs look to the next phases of recovery. This series is a manifestation of the IIB's commitment to continue to serve our members as you confront the immediate, short-term, and longer-term consequences of the economic, supervisory, and regulatory changes wrought by the pandemic. Today's session is the first of the series, and we're thrilled to welcome our colleagues from Deloitte to dive into conduct and remote supervision. What culture and conduct programs look like during the COVID-19 era, and how regulators are conducting remote supervision during this time. We're lucky to hear today from Irina Getchis-McCarthy and her colleagues Elia Alonso, Roy Ben-Hur, and Rick Higgins, all from Deloitte's New York office, as they lend their experience and expertise into these issues, with a particular focus on the unique challenges FBOs may face. Many of you know Irina as an advisor to the IIB and many of our members. She's a principal in Deloitte's U.S. banking and securities regulatory practice, where she helps clients with pre-examination diagnostic, post-examination remediation, and supervisory action responses. Prior to Deloitte, Irina was a senior examiner for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, Irina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. As we get started, Bridget introduced my colleagues by name. I will provide some additional color commentary about them. They provide, and I work with Roy, Elia, and Rick on a number of topics related to how banking and securities regulators are not only reacting themselves to the current pandemic and crisis, but also what we're hearing from our clients, both the FBO community as well as the U.S. institutions as well. And this is one of those topics that certainly is universal across no matter what type of financial services institution, whether it's U.S. headquartered or FBO headquartered. We will provide some highlights as we go through the conversation. And I've worked with Elia, Roy, and Rick on a number of topics across the spectrum of risk culture and conduct and supervision. This team also works cross-border. We work regularly with our UK colleagues and our other Asia-Pac colleagues that are in major trading centers around the world. And I think what we wanted to do is kind of take pause in terms of we're at a point, certainly within the current environment, of reflecting kind of many things in terms of what you as leaders in your organization have dealt with over the last 2 months, what we're seeing, and now as we look toward the recovery period. So with that, I will turn it over to Elia, and I will certainly take a look at whatever Q&A you have. Please post them so that we could be as interactive with you as possible. Elia.
Thanks very much, Irina. And I want to thank you, the IIB organization, as well as all of you for being here with us today. The agenda that we have for the next hour, as Irina mentioned, focuses a little bit on some retrospective review of how firms, obviously all financial service institutions, amongst those yourselves as FBOs, and what we want to look at is how have you all maintaining oversight over conduct, supervision, and surveillance in a remote environment that nobody was really anticipating, to the degree that obviously COVID made that happen. So the first topic, we're going to get started with Roy providing us with some guidance on the amount of disruption, in particular operational disruption, that COVID brought to all of us, how that may have impacted some of the initial responses from a supervision surveillance standpoint. We will also touch base on some of the collaborations that we had with several industry associations to show you some of the information that we have collected on these points. And then the second topic, we're gonna really quickly zoom into conduct supervision and surveillance, and really looking at the type of activities that we performed before COVID and what was the impact of change post-COVID, right? So very much looking at, you know, how you have all been affected, and also how regulators have responded to some of the initial challenges, and how the regulators themselves are adjusting to their own, you know, supervision as well as examination processes. And then the last topic, I will walk you through some of the areas of opportunity that the fact that COVID brought in a more accelerated workforce transition to a much more disseminated workplace, the fact that we have to address those conditions very quickly actually allow us to look into some of the areas of opportunity that we can actually make more of a quick change rather than waiting for, you know, additional regulatory guidance, as well as, you know, internal decision making. So there's some areas right now that I think we can address that could actually position us much better if something like COVID was to be repeated again. So if we move to kind of the first topic, perhaps Roy, I can transition to you now to kind of tell us a little bit about the amount of change that we had to face in the marketplace and how firms prioritize some of the initial responses.
Thank you, Elia, and thank you all for attending this webinar. As Elia has noted, we're kind of doing a look back into the last, and if I'm counting right, this is at least for us in the U.S. Week 9 or week 10 of COVID. Of COVID and market disruption. So if we've looked back and look at what happened in the markets within each area that we operate, starting in mid to late March, you know, we have seen increase in market volume and market volatility, with, you know, doubling of the size of markets activities compared to February. We've also seen many of the U.S. financial institutions with growing concerns about their ability to address, you know, any potential backlogs that were occurring due to those increasing volumes, and as well as workforce globally in the U.S. Moved to work from home. You know, we've seen a number of challenges growing up in those markets, stemming from issues with local bandwidth, you know, the ability of supply chain to support the need to share technical devices back with the workforce. And in some specific regions where the region itself was not set up to work remotely, the physical ability of some of the operations to switch away and work from home, specifically for many of the people on this call, I would note India was a main area of concern. We at Deloitte worked together on a number of industry initiatives around that. I want to talk about two of them and really look at kind of the questions and challenges that came out of those, and also through our discussions with a number of industry members. So way back in early March, we were engaged with a number of trade associations, SIFMA, FIA, AFME, ASIFMA, and ISDA, to help them approach the global FMIs and FMUs to understand their readiness to their changes. And we've gone through an exercise where we help those trade associations collect information about the readiness of the FMIs and FMUs to address the market volatility, the fact that they've moved to work from home, and their ability to, from a resiliency perspective, to stand up. We've also worked with SIFMA and a number of key banks looking at addressing at least the beginning of middle of March and early April, any outages or potential outages caused by the volume and their ability to address those potential issues around that. What we have observed around those discussions and the concerns that came across the industries, first and foremost, were about the ability of the infrastructure themselves to handle the increase in the volume and volatility that were driven from COVID-19. And in hindsight, when we look back, with a number of local outages, broadly, our infrastructure held back. I can say that discussion that we have had with a number of members, there's still concern specifically around settlement centers, where those settlement centers in some cases might be operating outside of the US, and the ability of those settlement centers to handle a lot of volatility and in somewhat concentration risk in those settlement centers. Second, the break resolution process, which is a fairly manual process, brought up a high level of risk across a number of the players in the market, especially looking back and addressing some of the backlog that were created because of the need to work from home, at least in the initial days, not having the multiple screens, having some issues with the ability of your systems to work as efficient as they were to work from home. The shift to work remotely also increased that issues with the break resolution. And then more importantly, as you look about your remote working arrangement, some of them looked at the way you want to work from your offshore, and I think, as I mentioned, specifically for India, as India moved to work from home, a number of market participants highlighted the issue that they've had with their offshore team to operate remotely, because those offshore locations were never planned to work 100% from home, and there were a lot of inabilities to do that, especially in areas where you were reliant on your third parties who were operating in those EDF locations. And lastly, especially in the early days, and I know that some areas we already walk away from this, the US workforce itself, who's working from home, experienced some efficiency issues, their ability to operate effectively, reliance on in-home bandwidth issues where the bandwidth wasn't planned, at least when you work from home, to deal with the requirements of the day-to-day. Again, some of the players we have spoken with already moved away and addressed some of those technical challenges now, but some are still planning to do that. Addressing issues like supplying Cat5 lines to their trading or sales members, having dedicated lines provided to those members just to allow efficiency in trading. Rick, if we can move on to the next slide. So what I think Yeah, so what we wanted to do is actually get an understanding from you is as to, while you work from home, which function in your organization is still challenged in terms of their ability to operate as closer as possible to business as usual. The sales and trading and compliance advisory teams, the middle office, ops team, front office, second line monitoring surveillance function, internal audits. As I was saying, one of the items that we've been doing and we've started looking at as now firms are thinking about re-engaging and re-engaging with the workforce and starting to plan on going back to the office. The notion that we have had, and we've presented this topic in a number of banks, we've presented it to SIFMA, is around re-engagement back to work. And the re-engagement back to work really depends on, in some firms, their ability to operate in a multifaceted business as usual. And what I mean by that is having some of your key, say, personnel going back to their office, should they be able to work from the office, dealing with items like, the ability to drive directly, the ability to park next to the office, people who don't have ISIC personnel, highly sick people in their houses and the like. And then some of the folks working from a BCDR location and the rest working from home. So if we look at the response, and I want to see where this stems for, so what we see is, and it's interesting, and it's very, very similar to what we've heard from other function, is that the sales and trading function seems to be the one that's less likely to operating as in a BAU mode. And what we've heard from discussions with a number of peer organizations is that those functions will probably be the first that we consider to come back into the office, whereas some of the middle office or even internal audit, the second line, will be the functions that will remain later on working from home. Some of them as way back as August 2021. And in some cases will never come back into the office because of this new operating model of some working from home and some working back from the office. Rick, if you can take us back to the next slide, please. So I want to quick touch upon this. So we, the Deloitte Center of Financial Services, ran a survey in mid-April looking at 100 senior executives in U.S. financial services to really understand the top 3 strategies and priorities that they would have going forward. And we asked them to prioritize that first, second, and third. And as we look through kind of the key finding out of it, so first, the items that our clients are thinking about is, how do I digitize as much as possible my client interactions? Ability to onboard clients in a digital manner, move away from wet signatures into electronic signatures. So that those are looking at their ability to really increase their digital capabilities and upgrade their infrastructure to allow them to walk away from the interactions that require face-to-face into a more digital way, keep your social distancing while managing security and protecting the firms. The other items that I wanted to touch upon is really thinking about their talent operating model in this new environment. And the new environment that I was talking about is having a multifaceted environment where some of your workforce will come back to the office. Some of them may work in another multi-remote location, such as your BCDR, while the rest will keep on working from home. So how will this new operating model will be managed? How will you supervise and control over that? And how this everything will work in tandem. And lastly, looking back and looking at our ability, and this is a good segue into really the new subject, is how will the new normal of our control, design, and digitization work? Where we can enhance our supervisory and supervision framework, designing new automated controls, increasing new technologies that will remove the non-value-added work by our staff, and allowing us to move forward in a more automated fashion. Elia, I'm going to move it back to you and allow you to move on to the next topic.
Thanks, Roy. So our next topic that Rick is going to start covering is really now looking at conduct supervision and surveillance. So we really want to discuss with you, the initial challenges that I think we were all fairly apprehensive going into the transition from working from the office to work from home that COVID generated. So we were fairly apprehensive on how we were going to be able to continue to effectively supervise and surveil all of our employees, as well as the transactions that we were making in the marketplace, when the majority of the workforce, if not all, were actually in a very disseminated environment, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about those initial challenges, as well as how regulators provided some guidance, as well as initial relief, as well as how regulators themselves are thinking about continue to supervise our activities, right? So, Rick, why don't you take us through and perhaps start with some of the key disruptors that position supervision, surveillance, and conduct oversight in a difficult position right at the onset in kind of March, early mid-March in the US?
Sure, thanks, Elia. Yeah, I think the environment coming into March and April really was a perfect storm in terms of kind of disruption, where we had this shift to everyone being remote and adopting their business continuity plans. We had this spike in market volatility that drove volumes through the roof and required a whole range of additional procedures to catch up. And in the midst of that, highlighted some technology and infrastructure challenges. So you had this kind of trifecta of people, technology, and business volume that created really an industry-wide challenge. We did see initially some of the regulators offering some relief to firms in the way that they addressed open actions and outstanding findings. So, for example, in the US, the IIB offered firms up to 90 days extension on some of their regulatory deadlines. However, broadly, what we have seen from regulators has been a reconfirmation of the expectations regarding oversight, supervision, and control over employee conduct, with a bit of the knowledge that in the past, these kind of disruptions have been areas where conduct issues have arisen and have become more obvious later. So, for example, in the US, we've seen the SEC and others, re-emphasize the importance of maintaining market integrity around protecting client and firm confidential information, and making sure that firms had and continue to operate all the right controls that they had in that area. Similarly, overseas, we've seen other regulators put out similar notices around their expectations to maintain controls over market abuse, over market integrity, and employee conduct. So really the regulatory tone has been, yes, there's some disruption, but that's no excuse, and really to maintain the status quo. In terms of kind of the way that regulators have approached their supervision and oversight in terms of exams, Irina, I might ask you to share some perspectives on what we've seen from some of the regulators in how they're adopting that kind of exam and remote oversight and supervision, in this period. And then I'll come back to some of the challenges that we've seen in the way that firms have operationalized their control and oversight program.
Sure. So maybe a couple of points. I think one, to Rick's point, I think regulators around the world have, with looking at the current situation, they've alleviated either issuance of net new sort of guidance or regulations, although there have been some things that I'll talk about. There's also certainly the element of those of you that may experience in the US at least more dedicated teams on site. Now they're not on site, but they're certainly still focused. And so I think that in exchange for much of that examination schedule, although there are exams still occurring at institutions, those that were deemed as strategic. So anything related to information security, some of the operational resiliency work that they were doing, certainly credit review, credit practices, still those examinations are occurring, although off-site. But I think in exchange for that, they're looking for more dynamic information. And many of you have already been reeling from the number of requests that you're getting, not only from the Fed, the OCC, but certainly the DFS. The DFS certainly issued to institutions, and many of you had to respond in terms of what were your plans. And so this is a topic related to conduct, remote supervision, and certainly surveillance that is going to be very key to them. They've already been focused on non-financial risk, and so the elements of operational risk that are certainly key and important to them. What that means is that they're looking for how you're internalizing, what are your lessons learned, what are your root causes, and certainly monitoring at a macro level to see if there are certainly vulnerabilities either within an institution or, to Roy's point, working through the industry associations at what is more, certainly systemic. But I think as I started the conversation, we see certainly as it relates to this particular topic, the UK specifically and the US are still aligned to their underlying expectations. We haven't seen necessarily that much of a throttle back in terms of the expectations that many of you have committed to in terms of some of the remediation around some of these topics. And so again, I think that this is key to the importance to them of functioning markets, and certainly how individual institutions are looking at not only how their trading functions are operating, but certainly across that 3 lines of defense. So Rick, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Arena. And look, I think one of the central challenges that we've seen as firms, operationalize this new remote operating model has really been establishing that communication link between your front office staff and your compliance, advisory teams and product compliance teams. Things that used to happen on the floor through discussion and interaction throughout the day have taken longer, and establishing that communication link, how things are getting done, the protocols around it, has been something that firms have really had to work on to get right and have the same impact. Broadly, we see a couple of challenges across 3 buckets. I think firstly on the technology front, the technology lift around the response for firms has been what I would classify as fairly immense. Although most firms have had good success in standing up what they need to. I think most organizations had some degree of plans around, what to do if a large portion of their workforce needed to be remote. But very few, I think, anticipated having 100% of your workforce operate remote. And that brought with it a whole range of network and bandwidth and remote access and various infrastructure challenges that had to be addressed. We have seen some firms take various approaches to that, including having alternate hours where people stay logged on or off of the remote technology. We've seen, obviously rapid deployment of additional capacity where required. There's also been a technology challenge with simply being remote, and certain things that cannot operate in the same way that they did in the office. The ability to record calls where required has been something that's been talked about fairly extensively across the industry, and indeed we did see some of the regulators offer some perspectives of how that can be achieved through other acceptable control processes. But there are other examples similar to that where the infrastructure at home just did not exist in the same way it did in the office, and some of those gaps have had to be plugged fairly rapidly by firms. And then in addition, there has been this push for new technology, right? We're doing today's webcast on Zoom, and many firms have gone down the line of deploying video capability to their organization in a way that maybe would be faster than they would have had we not been under this pandemic. And of course, that leads to challenges around oversight and supervision. There are typically processes that need to vet this type of technology before it's deployed to make sure that it can be controlled and that it is in accordance with all the rules and policies and guidelines within a firm. And some of those have had to be fast-tracked and or existing gaps in those just have to be lived with in the time being. There are, of course, also some handicaps in terms of oversight in just being in a remote environment. Again, things that happened day to day in the office or on the floor now take longer, that you need to call someone or ping someone or arrange a meeting or a video call. So things like pre-trade approvals, that could previously happen by gathering people around a desk, and then formalizing, now take a little bit longer. We have seen some delays of things around executions because of those types of processes that have had to be put in place. And firms have really had to work through how do you embed that consultation that just used to be more dynamic from being being in the same room. And of course, not everything translated. Firms operate a variety of controls, some of which are critical and others which are less so. And so we have seen that reassessment happening of what's important to do now, what can be deferred, what is a must-have, and what is something that we can come back to later. As we've seen with the market disruption, there have been instances where we've seen oversight personnel, control personnel pulled away from those activities to address some of the operational challenges, such as processing backlog. And in those instances, obviously making sure that the control processes, are revisited and that you're not creating another backlog that doesn't get looked at. In addition, there have been some control infrastructure challenges introduced by being remote. One of the more talked about areas around controlling access to client and firm confidential information and some of the different communication channels. Being at home obviously introduces a variety of new channels that may not be available in the office. People using their home internet can access personal email, can access personal trading accounts. They can use their own mobile phones to communicate with people in chat rooms that may be otherwise blocked by firm infrastructure. And so there is a need to make sure that people are reminded around what are the policies, what are the expectations and standards that need to be upheld, even though you may be remote and not in the office. And there are certain areas that, of course, are higher risk, such as those which we talked about sharing and protecting client and firm confidential information, that firms are now starting to look at, well, what other controls can we put in place if this is going to be, a longer term kind of normal. I will say that firms who have invested in the last several years around digitizing some of their controls, creating central storages of data and workflows that drive their control environment, have found this transition to be easier, although not without its challenges. And, that's certainly something that we're seeing firms now look at is for those controls and processes that we think are critical, how do we get them into that digital state faster and so that we can, have that in a more sustainable way going forward. Alia, I might hand back to you at this point if there's anything else to cover on this slide, or else we may go to a polling question.
Yeah, go ahead to the polling, Rick.
Okay, sure. So we bring up our polling question number 2, which is, where have you seen the biggest impact to your supervision and surveillance teams during COVID-19? And some of the challenges we talked around there of communication, operational issues, the number of alerts that may be created by the market volatility, and then some of the different tools and channels that are being introduced.
And perhaps, Rick, maybe while we wait for the responses, Roy, it may be helpful to advance to the next slide and talk a little bit about, some of the survey exercises that we did about, I think it's about a year ago, looking at some of the challenges and priorities for communication surveillance. And I think it will be very helpful to put into perspective for what COVID has introduced these days. And Roy, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you, Elia. And time flies. It's been, close to a year and a half ago. But we're losing time preference now. We're sitting in this COVID environment. But to Elia's point, we ran a study to try to understand practices around e-communication surveillance. This is looking both at e-communication and audio communication. And what the study identified were a number of key items. Actually, before we do that, Rick, do you want to quickly address the poll so I can move away? Might be a good segue to the results.
Sure. I think the overwhelmingly do we see the response around communication between front office and the compliance advisory teams, and that's certainly consistent with the feedback that we have heard across the industry, that challenge of people who are co-located being able to resolve issues quickly and timely and continue to address the client demand and client need, and that's certainly been something that has driven some of the adoption of these new tools, and continues to be a challenge. So
this is perfect, and actually those two key items lead into what we call what keeps you up at night out of the survey. So I do want to focus on those key items because it really relates to just the topics that came out of the discussions. So the main item was employees not using approved and monitored channels, be that WeChat, in some areas, your WhatsApp, or any other functions. This is now, as we move into this work from home environment, our ability to monitor those non-approved and non-monitored channels, becomes even harder, because we have an employee who's working from their desk office at home. They might be using their own personal device that in some cases is not allowed, by some firms is not allowed to be brought into the firms. And then there might be, they could be able to communicate using those non-approved channels with firms. So what we see is firms trying to deploy a number of additional support or surveillance technologies, starting from video, looking at their employees, looking at the way the communications are actually done, if there are breaking communications, to try to identify employees who are actually moving into what I call a non-approved and unmonitored channels. The other items remains is around data integrity, completeness, and accuracy. This was an issue before COVID. This becomes an issue with COVID, in the sense that our ability to monitor all communication channels, there might be instances with some communication protocols that just half of the call is being recorded on our side. It's not being fully recorded with the client interactions. And we know from dialogues with clients around that, what some of them are employing, using some regulatory guidance, is actually manually logging in those discussions, either by salespersons or traders, to make sure that there is at least evidence of the documentation of those communications. And then the third item was the broader effectiveness of our electronic communications and technology surveillance. And I think if we think about the questions we just asked, it was the last item, right? So we've had technologies that we've been using for years around communication surveillance, electronic and audio. In this new operating environment, does it cover all our interactions options now that my sales force, my traders, or others would like to use other technologies such as Zoom? Am I able to monitor Zoom? Can I configure the systems to monitor this risk? And my ability to really walk away from the purely lexicon review into a more automated and advanced system that will allow me to reduce some of the false positives that I'm getting out of just a pure lexicon review. And again, let's link to the next item, which is reduction of my false positive and increasing of my true positive. The other items that came across was the implementation of audio surveillance and vendor solutions. And so again, moving away from the legacy lexicon only based solutions and trying to employ more of machine learning and somewhat of artificial intelligence solutions to try to automate and streamline some of the functions. And then if I'll jump over the next three items, and then addressing what we call is regional differences requirements for both audio and communication surveillance. And I think, as Irina mentioned, right now what we see is there is a lot of convergence between the US and UK regulators in terms of their ability to control and monitor your supervisory personnel. I think that will be a question as we look into the next 3 to 4 months, even longer to that, as different areas will start moving back into the office, whether there'll be any differences in the regional requirements from those different regulators. And then lastly, the last item, right? So, what do we do to improve our ability to monitor our electronic communication, right? So moving away from purely lexicon-based reviews and applying more of a risk-based approach to find the true issues, identifying, the truly risky traders or salespeople who are working from home. And again, this is used by using a number of other data points that can enable you as a surveillance personnel or the surveillance control functions to identify, the more risky behavior, looking at trends and of trading over time, looking at breakage in communication, looking at employees who try to move from one language to the other, from supervised language to non-supervised language. All those items, creating more risk-based review and then targeting those risk-based personnel. Those are, so if I kind of summarize that, if we have done this survey and we have done it at about 12 to 18 months ago, the interesting fact is now with COVID, a lot of these items are more important, they're more focused, and we see a lot of the surveillance and supervision functions really looking at their abilities to streamline and improve their electronic communication and audio communication surveillance functions. With that, Ray, can we move to the next slide? And this is another polling question. If you think about your supervision and surveillance functions, what has been the biggest contributing factor for those functions, and how they best review their work in terms of this time, and how, I think if we think about it, how will they work better in the future? So if you can look through that, and Ellie, as while we get those responses, maybe we can start thinking about how this links into kind of the next subject we would like to bring in terms of thinking of the future automation, the digitization of controls.
Sure. Yeah, we can advance to the next slide while we wait for the poll, Rick. So, up to this point, we've been talking about some of the challenges that most of the firms have experienced operationally, by more in particular in supervision and surveillance, and how the conduct space is being managed. And now we want to talk a little bit about what firms did do more immediately when they transition into a work from home environment in early mid-March here in the US, but also what are some of the additional ideas or areas of focus that are starting to come up, right? Now the conversation is very quickly shifting towards, how do we come back to the office or, disaster recovery sites? How do we come back? Who comes back? What do we do in the office, right? So we're talking about that in a minute. Rob, we just got back the poll, the last poll, and we do see that still, the first item, which is around the trusted relationships between front office personnel and supervision and surveillance personnel, is actually key for success, right? That doesn't surprise me. I don't know, Roy, you have any comments on this one in particular?
No, I think it's similar to what we've seen before COVID. I think just having the relationship with the front office, but now in this COVID environment, as it was mentioned before, right? Most of the teams working remotely, how do you establish this trust relationship with your front office personnel? Your ability to interact with them as their trusted advisor, but in a remote environment where you're not close to the desks, you're not working across the floor and seeing what's actually happening there, and your ability to raise those questions in a more faster manner than you've had before. This is really the challenge, the challenge we see for our compliance personnel, and having those trust relationship and the ability to interact with the front office, makes the life of the supervision and surveillance teams much easier.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some of the additional items that came up here, but obviously ability to access information, reports, MIS information, we know that's been critical by obviously working outside the office, but we'll touch on those right now in terms of how firms have actually responded. So, in Deloitte, we like to look at things in threes, right? So we actually have 3 stages to evaluate how firms, how organizations are addressing the issues of COVID. So number 1, we're going to look at, what's just happened, how firms actually responded, what worked well, what are we hearing that seems to be a common thread amongst most institutions. And then we're going to look into kind of the medium term. So what is the recovery to reinstate, business as usual back in the office as much as possible? And then lastly, the third stage is, if this type of situation where we need to flex very quickly and potentially work in that very distributed environment, again, at a very quick turnaround, how do we prepare ourselves to be very successful very quickly in kind of that new normal, right? Which is kind of the third stage. So I'll take one at a time, and I'll be interested to hear from all of you about how much of this resonates with yours. If we look at the most immediate activities that firms have undertaken as part of transitioning from office and disaster recovery to a remote environment, the first thing that everybody was very focused on, besides making sure that people were equipped to work remotely, was to actually remind people, provide guidance on policies, procedures, information, what information is available, right? Reports, again, providing reminders of critical information to help people stay compliant, but more importantly, to protect ourselves, right, from any risks, right? So like things like, for instance, how we can continue to record conversations. If a salesperson is talking to a client, how can we continue to do so in a remote environment became critical to avoid additional risk on issues down the line, right? So there was a lot of focus around, if there is no capability to record information, how do we document that? How do we make sure that that's captured? There's been initial concern around insider dealing type of situations, sharing information, confidential information, as well as material non-public information. Those were initially the biggest areas of concern and where the guidance was focused, as well as very practical, I would say, playbook information to address situations where you were sharing an apartment or location with another person, whether it's a spouse or a colleague that's actually working in a role that will create conflict of interest for the same organization or very different organizations. So I think that was very quickly what most firms did immediately as people started to transition to work remote. Another area of focus was to look at what are the most critical risks, and hence the type of control activity that had to be maintained while working from home. And with that, some of the areas that were not as relevant, that would create more noise, such as anything to do with working off premises that will trigger many alerts. So those were obviously decommissioned or deactivated, right, for the short term. What we heard overall is there hadn't been additional controls necessarily being created. It's just how the current controls were prioritized in the most immediate time frame, right? Think about the first 2 to 3 weeks. In the longer term, we have seen most firms making more use of attestation, so increasing the frequency of attestations, especially for front office personnel, right? To make sure that it's not just about ensuring that information was recorded, but it's actually to trigger, again, that responsibility and awareness of the risk. Obviously, with the reminders, as well as some of the controls being kind of prioritized, some others potentially being, put on hold, there have been firms that they have actually performed more targeted examinations, internal examinations of their front office activities, as well as some of the areas where policies were actually relaxed, right? So in any areas where the business were more impacted, you may think about equities, commodities, etc. Some of the second line and even internal audit functions may have delayed some of the work around compliance testing or internal audit assurance work. But at the same time, there's been more targeted reviews and consultations with front office personnel to ensure that, again, compliance and risk management was operating as it should. The last point, and actually talks to some of the answers from the previous 2 poll questions, is really about how firms replicated the office environment in a remote distributed workplace now, right? So we have heard that this has been critical. It's not just to make sure that people could communicate through firm-approved video devices, but even more important, the frequency, again, of how communications were maintained, and the idea of having like an open channel, right? Whether it's through chat rooms, whether it is through Bloomberg chat rooms. Again, the idea is to make sure that if a front office employee needed to consult with compliance, or if compliance or supervisor needed to discuss items with the first line, there will be a very easy way to engage with each other. And we have heard that for most firms that was in place before COVID, and it was being used in a business as usual environment, that transition to a remote environment didn't create any issues, right? It's just the frequency the communications, and again, video communication in particular, to keep that office-like environment was very, very crucial. So those were some of the immediate things that most firms did to try and maintain that business as usual status. As we see firms moving more into the medium term, the key areas that most firms are now concerned about is about having the proper strategy to come back to the office, right? So they're looking, or we're all looking, Deloitte included, at the work that we do, the workforce that we have to actually perform the work, and the different sites or workplaces to determine what is the appropriate ratio and the phasing, right? So I think we're all kind of looking at the different strategies here, and the level of which we're going to be bringing people back to the office is going to be determined by criticality as well as that kind of health status, right, that we want to maintain in our workforce. We also talked about resilience in I think both Rick and Irina and Roy touched on this. Resilience is not just about technology. I think we all felt fairly comfortable on the transition, but it's also about the culture of the firm, right? So organizations are starting to think a little bit about how could they explore how the culture held, what were some of the strengths, if you wish, that were manifesting through very stressful times, and how can they actually improve and propagate and share lessons learned through the crisis to propel the culture even a little bit farther, right? And this is not to be done in isolation. I think there is a lot of conversations that are taking place between the business, the second line and third line functions to make sure that the lessons learned make sense across the enterprise. And then I just want to make sure that we touch on supervision, surveillance as it relates to how the function can actually continue to be evolve, right? When we have many, many more potentially trade floor environments, right? And the key to this, I think Roy mentioned, I think Rick touched on it as well, is about access to data, access to digital technologies, and analytics. Because if there is one thing that we are hearing a lot of is that all of those models for supervision and surveillance that were based on rules were very inflexible and hard to change. And even if you change the parameters by which you measure outliers, so to speak, even if you change the parameters, it was very hard to compare it to any historical point. So the idea here is that there is definitely an awareness of having to evolve, as most firms are very aware of, to evolve away from rules to more of a model analytics-based, alert-based system that is very much focused around new behavioral patterns that we cannot necessarily predict and basically create a rule around it. And one other interesting point that we, firms are talking about is whether supervision and surveillance goes beyond overseeing employee and market conduct, but also actually looking at how our employees are faring outside the office, in their personal life, so that we can actually bring some important data points back to reinforce that re-entry strategy, right? So is there a factor here for supervision and surveillance teams to access this type of data that can be generated through, checking temperature or taking some kind of health questionnaires, right? And bring that back to help the organization replan re-entry in a continuous basis, right? So again, I'm going to pause here because we're pretty close to kind of the end of our time. There is many more to come in terms of how to really prepare for the long term and a potential phase 2 of COVID, right? Or another similar situation. It is all about understanding, what are some of the priorities that could be addressed now to prepare better for the new normal. So let me take a pause here. I believe we're pretty much at the end of the time. So Irina, do we want to run our last poll question, or should we just take a check right now?
Maybe we run our last poll question just to see quickly, and then that may be a good way for us to end.
So our last question here is really looking at whether you, basically whether you see if COVID-19 situation has actually created or elevated the level of inherent risk in your organization, right? When you look at risk without taking into consideration controls, do you see that level of risk increase, and are you preparing to do something about it, right? And based on our conversations, there is a different degree of response to this type of question, but it will be very interesting to see what this group has to say. Irina, are there any kind of final remarks for this group as we wrap up the session?
I would just summarize maybe, we understand that this topic is certainly going to evolve. I think given kind of the timeline of where we are, 2 points I would say that, you know, certainly the regulators themselves will continue to monitor kind of their lessons learned. All of you as industry participants will continue to do that. Roy mentioned some of the work we've been doing with SIFMA and the other industry associations, as well as the IIB. So I would say that, you know, for this one, this is probably to be continued. I think there's going to continue to be, as everyone said, the focus on technology and digital controls. We didn't even just, you know, really talk about the concept of, you know, certainly even the drive toward preventative controls versus detective controls. And so I think that in that recover phase and going forward, I think there's going to be lots of debates around, Elia, your point about moving from a rules-based environment to more analytical and risk views.
Okay, great. And we just saw the poll coming back. You know, I think most firms that responded to the poll agree that the culture was in a good place, and obviously the controls and technology environment seem to respond well to the challenge presented by COVID. So that's about 40%. But obviously, most people are still looking at, you know, the level of risk and assess the situation going forward as well. So very interesting. Thank you very much. And Bridget, I don't know if you want to just say a few final words.
Exactly. So first, I want to thank all of you, Irina, Elia, Roy, and Rick, for this great presentation. It's a very timely topic, and this is just the beginning, right? As your last slide shows, respond, recover, thrive, we can look forward to. And I want to thank all of our members for joining. If you have questions following this, have you had some time to look at the slides, which will be posted, the presentation will be available via the website. Feel free to reach out and we can connect you. So thanks everyone, stay well, and thank you again, Deloitte, for joining us today.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.